for a lot of Christian communities, this is watching people who have been deeply affected by the faith, whose lives have been lived within the faith, saying that they have identified core attributes of the faith that make it impossible for them to be Christian anymore.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pastor Talk podcast. Been a while, a few changes that we wanted to make you aware of. In the past, we had tried to keep up regularly with weekly series, and we may still do that once in a while, but what we anticipate this season, at least for the foreseeable future, is to do something monthly and to kind of pick a topic that we think might be of interest. Maybe it will be current issue or contextual issue here in the church. Maybe it will be something in the broader community that we see. Maybe it will be something historic. We'll try to mix it up. We'd actually love to hear from you if you have suggestions to kind of treat this a little bit more like a teaching scenario or a classroom setting almost, but to try to provide a library of things, of topics, of information that we think hopefully could be helpful to you and that we hope will be relevant to you as well. So this is the first of those attempts as we kick off for our latest season of podcasting. Grateful that you would give it a chance. Like I said, we would love to hear from you if you have ideas, if there are things you would like for us to maybe do a podcast on, we'd love to accommodate that. So let us know and we'll do our best to respond.
Today we're going to kick it off with a topic that I suspect either you've heard of before and it's been a thing that has piqued your interest, or I think on the alternative side, this may be brand new for you. And it probably depends upon where you get your news and where you're engaged in different online conversations. But really, since 2020, really the beginning of 2020, there's been a marked rise in the conversation surrounding what people are calling deconstruction. And if you have not been part of that conversation, we'll pause quickly to sort of give you a sense of what we understand that to mean. Largely, people have been talking about engaging their faith in new ways and discovering along that engagement, often paired with a lot of frustration, often paired with some sense of hypocrisy or an awareness of bad faith within the religion. Christians have been talking about, especially in online spaces, a growing sense of needing to deconstruct or take away substantial parts of their faith with the idea that they might just sort of cobble together or find a different expression of faith. And I think most often, Clint, what people mean by that is non-Christian, though I think that sometimes people maybe mean that they are discovering a new form or branch of the Christian faith. I think largely I've understood it to be sort of deconstructing their Christian faith, which might lead to a more broad, non-specific faith or a kind of a non-faith in the broadest sense. And so in the midst of those conversations of people exploring that online, there's been several, even YouTube channels and several specific places where people have gathered around this idea of deconstructing. And more, there's kind of this call of people saying, that they have become uncomfortable with their faith. They feel like there's things that they need to discharge from their faith. And we've had some thoughts about that and wanted to explore that.
So for the last decade or so, the fastest growing religious group has been what is called the nuns, not Catholic women in black and white dresses, NONES, people who affiliate with no religious group. And we tend to think that those are people who were never religious. But this movement, I think, is a kind of charting of people who began as Christian in many cases, most cases. At some point, were probably fairly serious about being Christian. In many cases, were extremely serious about being Christian and have now made their way largely into that group called the nuns. They've now kind of disaffiliated themselves, not only with their church, but with the broader Christian faith. And this term deconstruction has been used as an umbrella to cover those experiences. And I think, Michael, as I understand it, and I think you have a better handle on it than I do, but as I understand it, one of the particular points of deconstruction is that it has tended to be public.
Right.
It's not simply someone who doesn't come to church and decides, I'm not doing that anymore, though I'm sure that's out there. Largely, this has coincided with the age of social media, in which a person either charts their movement or they discuss their movement. If you would, and I don't know that I recommend this, but if you would go onto YouTube and type in deconstruction, you would find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of videos, from Christian artists to former pastors to very serious Christian media personalities to people that no one knows, just ordinary you and me kind of people who have felt the need to sort of chart their own experience with leaving the faith as well. And there's a sense in which this kind of thing has always happened. It's always been a part of the church experience. But as I see it, this is different in the sense that it is more public. And because it's more public, it seems to be growing. It seems to be catching on in certain circles within the church. It went from a thing, even in those circles, from a thing you had really never heard of to now a thing that it seems like you hear about near constantly. Is that fair?
I think it's fair, and I think that there's also this tendency within the church, and maybe naturally, to have very high temperatures as it relates to this conversation. I don't think that people come to this with a significant amount of nuance, because for a lot of Christian communities, this is watching people who have been deeply affected by the faith, whose lives have been lived within the faith, saying that they have identified core attributes of the faith that make it impossible for them to be Christian anymore. And I think that there are a variety of responses depending upon where you are. So, we are in the mainline Presbyterian tradition. And in our place, I think that we are experiencing a form of deconstruction. But interestingly, I don't think it comes with all of that language. I think there are, post-COVID especially, many, many statistically relevant numbers about people who are no longer coming back into the doors of their churches. And that's for a lot of different reasons, by the way. So, some of that is, simply health changes. Some of that is life station changes. Some of that is the changes within their church, leadership or ways of ordering and structuring things. There's lots of reasons for it. But as those people may have fallen out of the church, they may have also lost some of the meaning that went with that experience, the meaning of worship and studying with other folks. And in the midst of that, they might find themselves moving closer and closer to that nun camp. Well, that is in many ways a kind of deconstruction, but not the public deconstruction that you're talking about, Clint. That, I think, is largely more rooted inside the evangelical or conservative church context, in which folks are often reflecting theologically, often even reflecting on their own personal anecdotal experience, sometimes of leadership situations that went very wrong, abuses within the church that were covered up, and in that hypocrisies of the church that they've seen and can no longer really live with as part of their faith expression. And then there's also some of the deeper theological conversations, so on. I don't want to overburden the conversation, but I do want to say that for the more evangelical or conservative Christians, I think that this isn't a thing happening quietly in the night. It's not people who have left the building that just aren't coming back and they're wondering where have they gone. This is people who are very publicly saying in public squares that the faith that I thought was the only faith is the faith that must be discarded for me to live my life in the most healthy, whole way possible. And so naturally, those Christian communities are often, I think, responding with a great and high degree of concern and oftentimes, unfortunately, judgment and even ridicule. And I think that it's worth sort of trying to step back from those conversations. I think it's worth trying to look at what's happening here. What would a Christian see in this process that people are describing? How does it really move beyond a historic Christian experience, if it does? And then how do we respond to that within the faithful Christian witness of today?
One of the very interesting statistical findings post-COVID has been that in many surveys, many people's attempt to figure out what is exactly happening in the church, the group that is leaving at the highest rate are older members, 60 and up, in many cases post-retirement Christians who found themselves drifting in COVID and now simply moved on to something else and sort of had a moment where they said, I don't feel compelled to go back to church. It's not that important to me. They may or may not consider themselves still Christian in some nominal sense, but they don't feel a need to affiliate themselves with Christianity as a whole or with any particular expression of it. Now, while I do think that's part of deconstruction, Michael, and I don't think this is surprising, that older generation has not broadcasted in the same way. They've not tended to go to YouTube and make videos rationalizing their experience and sharing their experience.
Right.
They've just left. They just went on and did something else. And unfortunately, we're not hearing much of their story. But the movement part of this has tended to be younger. And as you alluded to, it has tended to be more conservative. And by that, I mean it tends to be grounded in the conservative evangelical church. There may be some explanations to that. Again, maybe in the mainline church, people just drift off and don't feel the need to say much about it. Some of those people are giving their experiences as well. But what makes this, I think, particularly interesting and I do think unique is that by and large, this movement is comprised of people who were very committed to very moderately and even extremely conservative expressions of the faith. And so if they're on the right edge, it's not as if they're just saying, oh, you know what, I don't fit as Baptist anymore. I'll try Presbyterian or I'll try Lutheran. They're feeling compelled to skip over all that and find the exit door in some public fashion. And I think that makes this very interesting because that has not typically been a thing that we've seen. It may have happened, but it's much more public and much more visible. And I think that gives this a unique flavor in the moment we're in.
So let's look at this through a more historical lens, just very briefly, because obviously changing churches has happened for as long as church has existed, right? And this, throughout the entire 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries, couples would marry. You would have a Presbyterian and an Episcopalian, or you'd have a Lutheran and a Methodist. And this story happened hundreds of thousands, millions of times where couples would navigate that together. They would go to this church. Maybe they would both go to a different denomination. And then in a way, the path of their Christian faith looked institutional. It just looked like shifting from one place to another. And Clint, I don't want to just breeze by that. For some couples, for some people, that felt like deconstruction. It felt like I grew up and my family has been Methodist for the last 4 generations, and now we're going to a Presbyterian church because my spouse was this or that. And for them, there were real doctrinal or theological reasons for why that felt like they were deconstructing one part of their life so that they could enable another part. But that wasn't for them a process of destroying or breaking down their faith. It was a process of uncomfortable shifting to allow for other priorities. And I think that what makes this conversation truly unique is that many of these folks who are talking about deconstruction are doing so not from the frame of, well, I'm shifting from the Baptist church to the Assemblies of God church because I think that their expression of the Holy Spirit makes more sense in light of my lived experience. Or they're not saying, I think that the church that I grew up in had some abuses in it. And so I think that there's another Christian church that maybe has done a better job of hedging for that, and I can still live out my faith. No, what they're saying is that the core foundation of what they experience Christianity to be is flawed because of fill in the blank. And their reasons for that would be almost as often as unique as the voices themselves. So I think there's probably some consistent things. I think I've heard a lot of hypocrisy. I've heard a lot of judgmentalism. These are things that people express and say, Christians say this, but they do this, or Christians are supposed to be people of love, but they actually are people who pounce on others and judge them and box them in. These are often things I've heard. To whatever extent that's true, Clint, I think that is different from that historic movement because it's ultimately individuals saying, not I'm just shifting into a different branch of the church, but saying, I don't think that at the core, the church is what the church claims to be. And then therefore, they often find themselves in an a-religious place. They find themselves with some of the morals and character of Christianity being something that they think matters to themselves, but they don't find the language or the scriptures or the community to any longer be a place where that can be formed and grown and challenged.
Yeah, I think to some extent, at least for a lot of those folks, Michael, they feel that the foundation crumbles. It may be a path that is at first marked by disappointments with leadership or stances the church has taken, things the church has said. But I think many of those folks find themselves at a place where they say, I simply don't believe these things to be true about Jesus Christ anymore. Right. I no longer consider myself able to call myself Christian. And there certainly is a connection to that, because our experience as Christian is often lived out in a Christian community. And dissatisfaction with that community is always a challenge to our discipleship. But I think for a lot of these people, as I understand it, they have torn through those layers and at the core found that they simply no longer accept whatever it is that the fundamental or foundational doctrines they were taught mean. And so they move on to either nothing, I think in most cases, possibly some combination of various things, or just the idea of, I'm going to go on and be a good person, but I no longer need that because I no longer believe that. And I think maybe that's one of the characteristics of this idea of deconstruction, or this movement of deconstruction, is the idea of moving past something that, whenever we make those decisions, right, we hope that we're doing the right thing. We believe we're doing the right thing. So I don't think it always comes across arrogant. Occasionally it does. But I think for many of those folks, there is a sense of, I no longer need that. That's behind me. I'm done with it, and I'm moving on to something better in the sense of not untrue, not untrustworthy. That I found to be lacking, so I'm going to look for what's next. And some of them do it aggressively, and some of them do it, negatively and with anger. But I think far more often they say, I had some good experiences, but when I sorted it all out and I watched the videos and I read the books and I really sat down and thought about it, it just didn't feel true to me anymore. And I want to be clear that the sadness of that statement is that in many cases, if not most, those were people who deeply believed that at one time, or at least thought that they did. I would say did, most likely. And that does give this, this is not just marginal people falling out of church. Marginal church members falling out of church. That's always happened. I think the painful loss in this is different.
And I think that this puts us at a crossroads, Clint. I think at this point in the conversation, we all collectively choose. And by the way, I think that churches and institutions and individuals have made both of these choices depending upon their situation and their propensity. We could choose on one hand to make examples of these folks. We can choose to lift them up as objects of judgment and harsh language and say, yeah, you never believed all along, or say that you folks are, good riddance, hope it works well for you on the other side. There is a kind of judgmental, painful kind of response in churches that say, that we in the pain of you leaving are going to lash that out on you. And I think on the other hand, and I think a very difficult path to take, but an important one, I would argue, would be to ask, how have we come to a place where people are finding community with one another, and that community is rooted in the idea of the church not being what it said it was? What is it that they're responding to? Because every Sunday that we gather together in our sanctuaries, we're calling upon the truth of Jesus Christ. We're calling upon God's work in the world, this new kingdom as Jesus proclaims it. And I think the church, every time we return to that, we're called to return once again to the heart of what is the gospel. And that means we need to be open to where we've missed the gospel, where we've included things that are important to us, but maybe not central. Or we have told people that this is a thing that is central, and then as we've gone along the way, we've fallen away from that, and we've not been reflective or asked the question, why is that the case? And this is rooted for me deeply in the Reformed sense of truth. Reformed people have said for as long as we have existed that all truth is God's truth, and that ultimately we as humans by our natures get it wrong. We miss it. And so we bring to our faith a built-in humility, or we should bring to our faith a built-in humility. And in the midst of that, the Reformed voice would say, if folks are leaving the church and saying, I have to deconstruct my faith because of fill in the blank, we might want to ask the question, what is that fill in the blank? What are they talking about? Is that an accurate account of what we have said or what we believe? Does this differ from the core of the gospel, or have we missed the mark? Has the church in some ways missed the core of our proclamation? And surely it's not all of anything, Clint. Surely it's not that the church has been all wrong or that people have all misunderstood it. But if we aren't humble enough to admit that the church itself may have some stake in how people are expressing these experiences, then we're not hearing these people. And I think it's important that we do so.
Yeah, it is definitely a moment to listen to the stories of those who feel either hurt or abandoned or simply let down by the church, by their expectation. Those who feel that they didn't experience in the church a kind of life-giving story, that they ultimately found something that didn't resonate with their lives and their experience. And I do think it matters, Michael, and I don't mean this to be in any way, shape, or form a kind of slings and arrows at the evangelical church. But I do think because Reformed Christians have sort of lived with that idea of always reforming, right? That we're always trying to figure out where we're in error. We know because of our ideas of sin that there's no way we have it all right. And so at our best, we're trying to be open to guidance and adjustment along the way. We're constantly working on our understanding of faith. I do think in some ways the evangelical church has had a different approach, where they have tried to kind of lock down some doctrine on Scripture and in other areas of the church's life and say, this is what we mean and this is what we've always meant and will always mean. And I think they've been, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I just think it makes sense. They have been more rigid, so there's been less room to ask questions. So in an internet age where people have more access to information, there's more stuff out there, they find themselves confronted with things they didn't know more often. I didn't know that was in the Bible. I didn't know the church had said that one time. I didn't know this happened. I didn't know that happened. It's very hard in this day and age to keep that information compartmentalized. And as people begin to interact with, what do you mean there are places in the Bible that seem to contradict each other? And how could this have been written and this have been written by the same person? And those questions that were never really out on the table in those traditions, some of those traditions, now these folks are finding deeply disturbing. I think that's less true in our branch of the faith. It happens, certainly, but I think we've been, with that idea that all truth is God's truth, I think we've been a little more inclined to put our cards on the table and say, well, we don't know. And I do think that helps us in a moment like this, and I hope that our approach might be helpful to some of the folks who might be struggling in these areas. Though, again, it's not that they're finding another nest, it's that they're leaving entirely. And so we'll see if that remains true. But I think the Reform approach to being church may have something significant to offer in a moment like this for people who are struggling.
Yeah, and I agree completely. And I think that this is actually an opportunity to talk again about the importance of not just listening to other people, but listening to other traditions. Because I want to make it clear, I think the church writ large, the church with the capital C, Catholic Church, the whole church of Jesus Christ, it is in many ways in a form of institutional crisis right now. And the interesting thing is, I don't think that crisis looks the same in every branch of the church. I think that the mainline, certainly Reformed church, is struggling with a crisis of apathy, a kind of crisis of dissolving from its foundation and sort of falling under its own weight. I think that what we uncover with this movement towards deconstruction is a far more active kind of deconstruction, where folks are actually quite viscerally repelled by the Christian tradition, and they have learned some things, they've seen some things, and they say, I can no longer find the faith a valuable or helpful guide to my life. Where maybe some people in the mainline are also finding themselves there. I think more often there is just the faith has become less relevant for people in those circles, and they've just slowly over time drifted away from it without the kind of crisis event that people are describing. So one of the gifts that I think the Reformed tradition can obviously offer is this idea. For a long time, we've been thinking about the faith. For a long time, we've been engaging in nuance. For a long time, we've been asking difficult questions and open to the reality that there might not be simple answers to those questions. There's a great field of resources available and practices which have been leveraged in that time faithfully that I think can be helpful in the midst of the dark night of the soul. For people who are going through some really, really dark times with questions that seem bigger than what they're comfortable being able to answer, there's some confidence and strength in a Christian tradition that says it's okay. Like the psalmist, you can come to God in the dark night of denial and fear and even doubt, and you can lift up your prayer and know that even in that darkness, God is there. On the other hand, there is some real, I think, wisdom that the mainline can learn from the other, and that is that we must have conviction. We have to have things that we invite people to put at the center of their life. And in the midst of those conversations, it's good, we could go round and around and around upon pros, cons, and what can we learn and what should we avoid, and all these types of things. But I think, suffice it to say for this conversation, I think the point that I wanted to make at this juncture, Clint, is just that Christians who are experiencing deconstruction would do well to learn that there are Christian traditions maybe beyond what they've experienced in their own Christian walk that do have resources to aid in these moments of doubt and fear and uncovering human depravity and brokenness, that this is not ground that has never been turned over before. And if that's where you find yourself, my encouragement to you would be certainly avail yourself of those communities and those theological resources. Because even if you continue down the path of what you consider to be deconstruction, I guarantee you that people who have tended that ground before are going to have something to offer.
Yeah, I would certainly hope that for many it could be a moment of reconstruction, of rebuilding. It is not only okay, Michael, I would argue it's necessary occasionally to take faith down to its components and to examine our assumptions, our motivations, our core doctrines, and then see if we are led to put them back together in the same way. That's how we grow. That's how we change. And I think that's an important movement. I think what makes this different, and I think what makes this heavier, sadder in some ways, is the knowledge that almost nobody starts with, I'm leaving Jesus behind, right? That always has a starting point way up the road in, my church says some things about other people groups that don't seem loving. The people I surround myself with who call themselves Christian act like they're not. We claim that we follow this book, but nobody really pays much attention to it. I think, rightly or wrongly, the perception of something is wrong here doesn't start at the core. It works its way in. Mm-hmm. And frustrations with the church almost always begin as frustrations with people. And the lesson in that, I think, is to look for ways that we can grow in faith in ways that really affect people. Rather than just coming together, having church, going, oh, what does it look like to be community in such a way that there's room for people who are taking their faith apart and seeing if there's a way to put it back together? I think, how can we be a place where the only path that leads isn't out,
right,
but it actually leads to growth. It actually leads to fuller understanding. It actually leads to more serving others and to deeper discipleship. I think there is a great opportunity there, and I hope the church will take advantage of it, because I do think it could be a moment that we could learn something.
I think that's a very helpful pastoral turn in the conversation. And as people who work with people all the time, we could both bring to this conversation names and stories of people whose hearts are grieved as they have loved ones in the midst of processes like this, who have not returned to the church, who have found the church to not be a faithful guide to their life. And this brings great pain. Of course, if the church has been an important part of your life, it's going to be a struggle for you if your loved ones have left or deconstructed their faith. And one thing I would offer to you is that we should be very, very careful in how we accompany and walk alongside those going through these processes and experiences, who are processing, in some cases, the trauma of a church experience that went wrong, leadership that wasn't held to account, faith which was proclaimed but not lived. We've got to be very careful as a person engages with real questions and wholeheartedly desires to see where they go, that we don't shut down those questions, and we don't tell a person, stop, no, you can't think that, you can't. When we respond, even sometimes violently out of our own anxieties or fear about a question or conversation, I think what we're doing is we're not having our faith and trust in God. Because at the end of the day, the Spirit of God is alive and at work in the lives of these individuals. And whether or not they're able at this moment in their life to call that the work of God, whether or not they're able to see the presence of God, I think one of the unfortunate things that has happened, Clint, is people have talked about this process of deconstruction almost as if it's an individual process and almost as if they're on the journey by themselves and that it hasn't ever been taken before. And by the same account that you and I could talk about people who've been deeply grieved by family members going through processes like this, I think we could also talk about people who have been through life's deepest and darkest valleys, some of them for decades. Christians who have had their faith stripped back to the very basic core fundamental aspects of the faith because of the struggles that they've had, because of the experiences of life that have come upon them. And some of these men and women have become giants in the faith in the midst of that process. What would have appeared from the outside to have been doubt and fear and anxiety on the other side looks like unimaginable faith. I think that someone, in the public imagination like that would be Mother Teresa. If you ever read her journal articles or her journal entries, she expressed a substantial amount of doubt and fear and anxiety. And yet, from the outside view of her life, she's an expression of Christian faith. I think that is an important thing to remember as we accompany those going through this process. Don't allow our own anxiety to get in the way of people engaging real questions and asking those questions with them and being with them in the midst of that difficulty. That's a difficult aspect of faith, no doubt. But I think an important one as we truly trust that God is able to bring us through these seasons of life.
I think that's an interesting idea, Michael. The concept that deconstruction thrives on the idea that faith and doubt can't exist together. And maybe that explains why this has been more common, at least it appears more common in the fundamentalist evangelical church, where doubt is looked upon pretty negatively and pretty strongly. I think, again, in our tradition, one of the benefits is to say that doubt is a part of faith, that faith and doubt have to be in conversation with one another. And hopefully Christian community is the place where we have the freedom to work those things out and to bring that doubt in front of the throne and to let God do God's work in us, even in our doubts, in spite of our doubts, even sometimes through our very doubts. And again, it seems very interesting, this idea that you couldn't have a faith that could manage belief and struggle to believe all at the same time. I think that's a misunderstanding of faith. I think that's not the gospel. And I think the danger in that is that it leads people to conclude, well, if I have doubts and I have struggles, then I must not have faith. I'll just see myself out. That's not how we think about faith. That's not how we think about discipleship in our branch. And I hope maybe our branch will have something to say at some point to offer a third path for those who are struggling. That's too early to say, but I do think the Reformed perspective has something to add in that conversation.
The public nature of deconstruction also matters, Clint. And I think the way that people are expressing that in online spaces should be really given some attention, because the moment that we feel separated from a meaningful, trustworthy community is the moment that we feel alone, that we have to make these kinds of deconstructive choices about what is and isn't in the faith. And I'll be honest, as people who work very closely within Christian community, it's full of good and bad. I mean, Jesus tells parables of the weeds and the plants growing together, and the idea that that's the way that it is by design. The church is full of good and bad. one of the ways that we tune our consciences and the way that we tune our ability to understand the good news of the gospel is to encounter our brokenness in relationship to others and to see the goodness of God at work even amidst that brokenness. That process is actually both and. And I think the moment when we start to feel isolated and that we're sort of us and our camera and we're broadcasting these experiences, I think there's a danger there of beginning to lose connection to a meaningful community who can help us to navigate these things. And so therefore, I think it's incumbent upon Christians within the community. I'm speaking to those who consider yourself to be within the Christian circle at this moment. Then it's incumbent upon us to be people who have space for those who are struggling, who can respond with generosity, who can listen with empathy, who can have compassion for those going through darkness. And if that's the least that you do, is to practice that in response to others who may be expressing these things, that is a part of Christian discipleship. I think that's a thing that the church, capital C, should care about. And I think that is not necessarily a thing that churches, with lowercase c, are communicating. And so I do think that's one thing that we can do. And I think another thing that we can do, quite frankly, is to become comfortable with recognizing that where we discover doubt within ourselves is an opportunity and invitation to explore a path that might actually lead us to deeper faith. And that's not a conversation I've heard happen substantially within this idea of deconstruction. I personally, and this is anecdotal, I've never heard of a person who said, I have been deconstructing my faith and it has led me to a deeper place of faith here. It's often, and I think up to this point universally for me, been a process that led them outside of the faith. And to whatever extent we can, I think Christians could normalize the process of doubt is not a exit path outside the church. It's an invitation deeper inside the church, but we would have to have the courage and the language to do that.
Yeah, and maybe as we move to the close, Michael, a word to those who might find themselves in that process, struggling with the faith, maybe at some point pretty plugged in to church, to faith personally, communally, and now feels themselves drifting. And the counsel I would offer is share that process with someone, preferably a pastor. If there's a pastor that you can trust, a mentor who is Christian, I think you will find that people have been there before. If you're gaining access to new information that is troubling about Scripture or theology, find a local theologian, a pastor, somebody. One of the things that sometimes happens is people feel like they've discovered new information. You and I have laughed about this many times. You get these questions from non-religious people. Did you know the Bible says that? Yes, we know. We've been reading the book as seriously as we could for 2,000 years in the church. There's not places in there that we don't know about, right? And so somebody has wrestled with these things. And if you can get yourself an audience with somebody who has traveled some of that ground, I think it can be helpful. I think it's always dangerous when we try to navigate those monumental things alone. And so if you're struggling, share that struggle with somebody, bring somebody into it, preferably someone with some credentials within a church, maybe a different kind of church than the one you're going to. If you're struggling in one kind of community, call a different community. Say, hey, I need to talk over some things I've been learning. Could you help me? Maybe it doesn't do much, but maybe it helps you find a path in which deconstruction can become reconstruction. And what you put together might be different, but it might also be better. You might find it more usable. You might find it more applicable. You might find that it fits better for what you thought you know without giving up the core of what it is that stands at the center of our belief system.
I would only offer one additional word on top of that. There's a Christian writer by the name of C.S. Lewis, who once offered the counsel. He said that it's always advisable to read two books at the same time, read something new and read something old. And to that end, I think my recommendation would be, it is tempting to have all of our faith exploration done in the new, to do it if you're a person on social media, to do that on Twitter or Reddit, or to be part of a YouTube community. That can be helpful. But I would advise you that there is deep wisdom in also returning to what is old. And that may be different for different people. You will certainly find within this channel and within some of the series that we've done, our own book recommendations that we've made on people that you might want to read. Topics like forgiveness, topics like grace. There's a lot of different resources that you can find, and we'll certainly be happy to help you if you want to go into the comments and you have a particular request. We'd be happy to help you with that. But the point being here, we would miss something if we didn't return to the wisdom of ancient people. That they carried forward the faith for literally millennia. And in the midst of that process, there's often wisdom that comes in helping us to see the limits of what we think we know right now. And there is a kind of immaturity that looks like getting spun up over conversations happening in the present and not returning to and seeing some of the wisdom of those in the past. And, maybe that would be a C.S. Lewis for you. Maybe that if you're more theologically inclined, that'd be a Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Maybe that would be even further back in the St. Augustine and his confession. But in the midst of your own walk in faith, I would just recommend look broader, because in the midst of that exploration, you might discover that there are more paths available to you than just one path. And that can often lead us in really unexpected places.
Yeah. Sometimes, when it's cloudy, when it's dark, just don't forget that is inevitably part of the Christian journey. It feels incompatible with the faith, but it truly is part of the faith. It is how we learn. Those seasons of the faith offer us growth, and growth is uncomfortable. And it's no disrespect to those who have decided they don't want to be a part of church anymore, but we've all been there, and many have persevered, and I think we learned something from those who didn't find their way out but found a way to stay.
We realize that this is a heavy conversation in many ways, and it touches many of our lives in real ways, not symbolic ways. And so certainly, as we always hope to be, let us know how this touches you in the comments. So we'd love to have conversations that are meaningful, and certainly want to recognize that in the midst of lived lives of faith, that we need one another to do that. And so we're certainly glad that you have made it thus far in the video. If you've made it thus far, thank you for giving us your time and being willing to engage with us in a conversation that sometimes takes some turns. And we certainly hope that you will continue along as we have similar but different topics in the future.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for being here.